Let me begin by explaining to all of you, first off, some of my personal experience with Native American Indian law, and then translate it into what I think is best for us, for all of us here in Hawaii, with Native Hawaiian rights and federal recognition of Native Hawaiians. For myself, there's been two experiences I think that stand out for me in dealing with Native American legislation. The first is when I was a young lieutenant, I went and completed my officer's basic course in Fort Lee in Southern Virginia. Coming from Hawaii, I was very inexperienced and had no concept of dealing and interaction with what Native American rights and laws meant. And for me, it was a fascinating experience in working with the Army and how the Army interacted with the state of Virginia, but also with neighboring Indian tribes, with the large operations that went on over at Fort Lee. But I have to confess that my interaction was at best superficial. I think I got a better understanding in terms of dealing with Native Indian law, Native American Indian laws, practicing actually as an attorney here in Hawaii. And one of my initial experiences was I had represented a company called VoiceStream, which is now defunct, or I shouldn't say defunct, but it's now gotten taken over by T-Mobile. VoiceStream, its largest investor, actually its second largest investor after Craig McCaw from McCall Cellular, was the Cook Inlet Indians over in Alaska. And as I got to know and interact with them, I began to see that how this can work for the benefit of an indigenous people. That done right, this is a program with federal recognition of an indigenous group of individuals, can work to the betterment and help a set of individuals who might otherwise be ignored by the state or local government. I believe here for Hawaii, there are positive things with federal recognition of Native Hawaiians. I'd like to see Native Hawaiians treated in a similar fashion and treated fairly as Native Americans are. Now that doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean that we should give a blank fiat and automatically say whatever happened in the state of Virginia or the state of Alaska should automatically be adopted here in Hawaii. I think that any sort of recognition should come with, through, and after negotiation with the state government. Because while I do believe that the federal government should recognize Native Hawaiians, and I'm willing to support a version of the Akaka bill, I think it should come only after state negotiations. And that's why I am not supportive of the current version that's moving before the US Congress, but am supportive of previous versions that did, I think, protect not only Native Hawaiian recognition, but also was fair to all of us here in Hawaii. So that's what I would do if I were a member of Congress, and that's, I think, the direction we should move in. Thank you.
We have a 1 minute rebuttal. I'm going to use the 1 minute rebuttal because I believe that what we haven't really made very clear is that the relationship of the state of Hawaii to Native Hawaiians is a trust relationship. And that was what we assumed as an obligation when we became a state. That's part of the Admission Act. You hear about ceded lands. Ceded lands is a 5F obligation which was created, and it is for the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians as defined under the Hawaiian Homestead Commission Act. And we hold these lands and this value in trust. So let's not forget where we begin as a state. We begin with a fiduciary obligation. We begin with a trust obligation. And I see the Akaka bill as a method by which we are going to fulfill that. Let's not also forget the fact that there's the apology resolution for the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. In that bill, it provides for the reconciliation process. The Akaka bill is the reconciliation process. So when you look at this whole situation, you realize that we have a higher obligation as a state to the Native Hawaiians, to our host culture, to the indigenous people.
We have one more Akaka bill related question and then we'll proceed to another topic. The Akaka bill does not provide a land base for Native Hawaiians. Governor Lingle opposes the inherent sovereign authority provisions of the current Akaka bill. Without a land base and without inherent authority as negotiation tools, what other negotiation tools are available to the Native Hawaiian community to ensure that the negotiation process is fair and equitable? We'll start with you.
I didn't know that was the next question, but you hear the same words that I was using. The land-based aspect of it is because it does not provide for the concept of Indian country as defined under Indian law, and that is the lands to be held in trust for the Native Hawaiian government entity as it's held in trust for the Native Americans. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a land base in the future, because technically, when you look at it now, the only land base that Native Hawaiians really have is what's held by the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. The other lands, the ceded lands, the crown lands, which were returned when Hawaii became a state, are really held in trust. So, what I foresee that will happen, and that's the reason why this is one of the issues that I feel is still left unresolved in Congress, even if the Akaka bill passes, is that we must do that amendment. We must eventually create that Indian country and that land base for any sovereign entity or any Native Hawaiian governing entity, which this bill is really about, is able to function. It needs that land base, and it's going to require an amendment. But I also believe that in this process with ceded lands and so forth, that that land base will probably develop either through negotiations or possibly through further litigation with the state. Now, also the concept of inherent authority was one that I had mentioned earlier. Inherent authority is that ball of rights. The way I see that the amendment has been written that will probably pass is that those balls of rights are limited. In other words, there are exceptions to that inherent authority. It's going to take time before, and you need the right person in Congress if you care about this, to be able to basically eliminate those limitations over the period of time. And these limitations are there while the negotiations are going on. So when that negotiation ends, or should end, that is when I anticipate that you will have the concepts of inherent authority. In the meantime, they will have to continue to look at ceded lands, continue to look as to whether the obligations that the state has to basically the Office of Hawaiian Affairs as that entity that we have given our responsibility to for the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians. We have got to look at that and determine if, in fact, those issues are going to be resolved by way of land transfers and possibly money transfers as well. Because those are our obligations, and those are the obligations the state did not meet, and that's why it must be addressed. Those are all components of the basic development of a Native Hawaiian governing entity.
Let me make a few quick points here in terms of Native Hawaiian recognition and a land base. First off is that I do believe that the state government, the federal government, does need to resolve this issue regarding ceded lands and crown lands. And I do believe some sort of jurisdiction must be eventually given with federal recognition to a Native Hawaiian governing entity. But the question was, how are we going to ensure stable and fair negotiations? Well, the wrong way to do it is just by fiat say this new entity is granted all of its powers and rights, and it's defined in Washington, D.C. and not defined here in Hawaii. That's why I do support that any progression forward on this particular measure should have transparency. It should have public input. It should invite the people of Hawaii, and we should have public hearings here in Hawaii to discuss this matter. Now, the most compelling point I want to make, however, is how do you ensure that your government do something fairly? This is not a point just for the Akaka bill, but this is a point I think for government in general. We can put in regulations, we can put in as much rulemaking as you want, but at the end of the day, the bottom line, the best thing you can do to ensure a good government is elect good people. And the responsibility and burden of that rests upon the voters of your community. And I have faith in democracy, I have faith in the people of Hawaii. I believe that we set forth a negotiated settlement of this matter through the federal government. Instead of setting things by fiat, we will get a fair resolution of this long troubled matter. Thank you.
Let me again perhaps try to answer it in the bigger picture and without getting into the legal subsidies or subtleties. Although I'm happy to engage in that at some other point, maybe up at the UH Law School. If one believes in federal recognition, and if one believes that the principles are sound to establish a legal framework in place for Native Hawaiians as